Good. Is it better? Oh, no, not better at all. Okay. Good morning, team. Still waiting on some folks to get into the waiting room. I'm sorry about this lighting. I may have to move because this is just obnoxious. Okay. Let's do a few more. That's not as bad as I thought. Yeah, the sun is hitting our front door like right at the right spot. It's just coming right back off the computer. Hey, May. Hey, buddy. Poor little dog had to go to the vet this week, so there's a chance I have to jog out of here to let her go do her business because she's had some tummy issues. She's feeling better. It's still not all the way good. All right, so tentative plan for today. We are going to finish up the lecture for chapter 2 and then do a Kahoot on chapter 2. We are not going to have a test this weekend. I would have given you all a heads up on that beforehand. So I know that's what it says on the course schedule, but we got a late start to this class just because the format had to change. And I kind of went back and forth on that, trying to figure out what would be best for you guys. And I just didn't want us to get behind too much, but so what I think we'll do next week is start at the beginning of chapter 5, which is learning, which is kind of going over stuff that we've already talked about a little bit. But then we will do the second half of lecture next week will be our review Kahoot for chapters 1 and 2, because that's what the first test is on, is chapters 1 and 2. So we'll do our review Kahoot for that. So this weekend, you will have some kind of assignment. It'll probably just be a discussion board question, just to give you guys some more time to study. It won't be like the assignments we've done so far. But speaking of assignments, I do have, I think almost everybody that got it to me either before Sunday night or like on Monday. I think I have everybody's graded for assignment 2. Y'all did a great job on those for the most part. I think the biggest thing that I would advise you to check is to make sure that if you're including a source, that it is a reputable source. So how do we do that? So most of the time, if you use Google Scholar, you'll be fine. Google Scholar can also, and something we ran into in the other classes, it can get a little bit like niche, if that makes any sense, just because it provides, it works just like Google search engine. It gives you results that it thinks, like its algorithm thinks is best. And now studies have like been written to have SEO in them, so they can get to the top of those lists. But it can be like if you're doing a report on depression or something, you type that into Google Scholar and be like, okay, well, how does depression work? It might give you a study about 15 85-year-olds in Thailand and how this specific medicine affected them. They're like, well, that's very specific. Doesn't really give me a whole lot of information about depression as a whole. It's a pretty small sample size and a pretty specific group of people. But that's a lot of times how research works, because it's difficult to get good, large representative samples. So you kind of have to piece it together as a puzzle. So what you want to avoid, though, is a lot of times you will find exactly what you're looking for, but if you're doing something on ADHD, it'll be on like addnet.com, and I don't know if that exists, but it's just what came to mind. And then it may say exactly what you're looking for, but addnet.com, it might just be some guy's blog that isn't regularly vetted or checked, hasn't been peer reviewed, doesn't have the right credentials to be recognized as like a good academic source. One thing I did notice in like the in-text citations, when you cite something in the text, you put the author's name, not the name of the article. And if you do cite something from like a big government organization, so like they're not even just paragovernmental organization like NIH, CDC, WHO, any of those guys, most of the time they don't have like specific authors on their articles. So you would just put the name of the organization and then the year, which most of the time is just going to be the year that you access the article, because they update their stuff pretty regularly because that is their job. Okay. So I think that is pretty much all I had. I think the only thing is I took off points for, and pretty much everybody got a 20 out of 20. Were if you didn't do in-text citations, I think I took off 5 points like at all. We just said, no thanks on those. Took off 5 points, which is still a 15 out of 20. It's only 5 points off. That's not a huge deal. And then if you, like, I had a couple people not do the in-text citations, but did a works cited page, which is a thing, but not the right thing. And we'll do like a more formal works cited page later on in the semester, teach how to do those correctly in APA. So yeah, those are pretty much the only things I took off for. Or if you didn't meet the, the word count requirement, I think was 250. So if you didn't clear the 250 word, 1 page threshold, I might have taken off a little bit. Those are pretty much the only things. So if you have any comments about that, you can put them in the chat, or you can email them to me and I can get back to you on that. But today we are going to go back into chapter 2, which is our biology and psychology unit. Also, if you hear a noise, my washing machine is running right now, so it's not a big deal. My house isn't burning down or anything. But I think last time, and that's what I was doing before I got on here, we got all the way up to the endocrine system, started talking about our glands. So we are going to start a little bit before that and then catch up. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So we're going to start back with the peripheral nervous system. Yeah. All right. Peripheral nervous system, and this part is review. So I'll move my window here, so I'm not cutting off half the words. All right. Peripheral nervous system includes all the neurons that are not in the central nervous system. So if it's a neuron that is not in your brain or your spinal cord, we would say that is in your peripheral nervous system. So like my hands, shoulders, knees, toes, all that kind of stuff. Nerves are bundles of neurons. So not just one single neuron cell, but a whole bunch of them. We'll classify that as a nerve instead of just one neuron. You put enough nerves together, you got yourself a nervous system. So what do peripheral nerves, sensory nerves do? They tell the central nervous system about the body's external environment and internal environment. So if you're hearing my washing machine right now, that is one of your sensory nerves, your peripheral nerves telling your brain, hey, that sounds like, they're in the spin cycle, whatever. They're also telling you things about your body. So if you are experiencing some kind of change in temperature, you will, a lot of times you will either sweat or you will start to shiver. All that comes from sensory nerves telling your brain, hey, I think we might be a little hot. Your brain then says, okay, I will tell the sweat glands to start doing their thing, and you'll start to sweat, and they'll hopefully cool you down. So yeah, central nervous system makes sense of this information and responds using the interneurons, and they send information back through the nerves of the peripheral nervous system out to your tissues. There's 2 branches to the peripheral nervous system. You got your somatic and autonomic. We'll talk about what those mean right now. So a somatic nervous system, the somatic nervous system, includes sensory and motor nerves. So just what I just talked about, sensory nerves. So if you're hearing me talking, that is your sensory nerves picking that up. If you're seeing the screen, the sensory nerves in your eyes are communicating that back up to your brain. And then whatever response you have to that sensory information, you would control it through, or not control it, through your motor nerves. So your motor nerves are the ones that actually make you move. Hence the name motor. Gather information from sensory receptors, and they control the skeletal muscles responsible for voluntary movement. So things like taking notes, typing on a computer, playing the piano, things like that. That is your somatic nervous system, the thing that you're in control of, voluntary movement. All right. Autonomic nervous system, controlling the involuntary activity of the body. And so this is stuff that you don't have control over, because right now, in addition to listening quite carefully to me, of course, you are also doing things like breathing and digesting, and your heart's beating, and you're not controlling those. They just kind of happen. Your brain has streamlined that process, so you don't have to, spend extra energy controlling that particular activity. So like you're blinking, you're not telling yourself to blink, you just do it. There's two divisions of that. There is the sympathetic nervous system, which is your oblique system. And so like if you are, being attacked, your sympathetic nervous system will kick in, especially if it's a very immediate threat. Anything past a certain time domain would switch into a hormonal response. We'll talk about that later. This is your fight or flight system. Probably heard that term before. So what happens in that kind of situation? Like it says here, your pupils will dilate, which means that you'll be able to see better. You'll increase your respiratory rate, increase your heart rate. It means that you're getting more blood and more oxygen to your tissues, so that you will be able to run if somebody is chasing you, or get away, somebody's attacking you, things like that. It also, and this part is particularly interesting, things that are sort of not needed in a time of crisis. So like you don't need to be digesting food if you're being attacked. Those things will be kind of put off for later. So they will, a good example of that is like if you have to pee right before you get into a survival situation, instead of relaxing, your bladder will constrict. So your body's like, okay, we don't need to worry about that right now. So it'll constrict your bladder, cut off that process for a second. We'll worrying about relieving ourselves once we survive this attacker. So your parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite. So after that, moment of fear, their parasympathetic nervous system takes back over and says, okay, we need to calm back down. Do things like constrict your pupils, decrease your respiration, so slow down your heart rate, slow down your breathing rate, and then things like digestion, if you need to pee, things like that will kick back in. And you can kind of see how our neurotransmitter discussion from last week would relate to this. So for your sympathetic nervous system, you're going to be utilizing neurotransmitters like norepinephrine or noradrenaline, which makes sense because if you think about what adrenaline does in a situation, it's going to heighten your awareness, heighten your senses, do all the things that we're talking about. And then a neurotransmitter like GABA or adenosine is going to take over for your parasympathetic nervous system to get you back down to homeostasis, to get to the point where you are relaxed. All right, so there is another option here. So the neurotransmitters, the nervous system, are our fastest chemical messengers. There is another way to do this. The hormonal system, the endocrine system, is the more long-lasting one. So what's a hormone? You've definitely heard that term before. Chemical messengers released into the bloodstream that influence mood, cognition, appetite, and a bunch of other processes and behaviors. Things like testosterone and estrogen, those are hormones. Adrenaline can also act as a hormone. We'll talk about a bunch of them as we get to the glands. So how are they similar? They're both chemical messengers. How are they different? One is a lot faster, one's a lot slower. So the nervous system is faster, endocrine system is slower, but they functionally do the same thing, and they're pretty much always talking to each other to make sure that what needs getting done gets done. All right, so hormones come out of these little structures called glands. Okay. The most important one is your pituitary gland. So you can see it. It's this little peanut looking thing at the top, right underneath the brain. Yeah, under the hypothalamus, which we'll talk about in a bit. And so we call that the master gland because pretty much every other hormone gauges what kind of action it needs to take based off what the pituitary gland does, and it plays a role in regulating growth. So it secretes human growth hormone. And we've talked about how that sort of system can be messed up if you have a condition like acromegaly or gigantism. People with gigantism don't typically live that long because your body's not built to support that kind of level of human growth hormone for a super long time. It's also a cautionary tale against using things like anabolic steroids, which also boost human growth hormone levels. Your adrenal glands. So if you look at that word adrenal, it makes sense that a hormone like adrenaline would be secreted from that. So it's involved in responses to stress. We talked about your sympathetic nervous system and how in a stressful situation, um, you know, we're talking about life-threateningly stressful, and then also just like taking a test kind of stress. Adrenal glands are going to be involved in both of those. And salt balance. And so we also talked about glutamate. We started our neurotransmitter discussion. Yeah. So glutamate is usually, if you have some sort of like glutamate sensitivity, you can't eat super salty things. And this is involved in that. Your thyroid, you've probably heard that term before, located in your throat. It regulates metabolism. So if you've heard of somebody having a thyroid issue, they might have either too fast or too slow of metabolism. And that is because of this hormone called thyroxine. All right, so now we're going to talk about brain stuff. So this young lady had what is called encephalitis, so swelling of the brain. How did this change her life? So it impaired her movement and thinking, and the most, I don't want to say the most important, but the sort of most characteristic sign of this is that she had seizures. So what did they do? They did something called a hemispherectomy. So what are the hemispheres? This is your cerebrum. If you've ever seen like a brain or a brain, model, this is probably the thing that stuck out the most. This is the largest part of the brain. This is not the whole brain because there's a bunch of stuff up underneath it. But the cerebrum is that sort of like walnut shaped thing. There's two parts. You got your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. And then you can kind of see like there's this sort of canyon in between them. And there's this band of tissues that runs in between them. It's called the corpus callosum. And so that allows communication between the two halves of the brain. So you may have heard that like some people are left-brained or right-brained. That's not actually a thing. That is sort of a pop psychology idea. No matter what your brain is doing, whether it's writing or doing math or trying to shoot a basketball, like all of those things are always communicating with each other. But one thing that is true is that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right. Okay, so what's a hemispherectomy? So that is removing one of these hemispheres, or at least most of it. So why would you do that? So they've actually found that this can cut down on symptoms for something like epilepsy. They obviously don't do this a whole lot. It's a very rare treatment because it's pretty bold. They pretty much only do this if everything else has failed. You can also do something called a split brain operation. So in the case of somebody, I think her name is Christina. Yeah, Christina, nailed it. She might have had issues with one part of the brain communicating with the other half. So what you can do is sever that corpus callosum so that the two halves don't communicate with each other anymore. But what that can create, I think this is on the next slide, it can also turn your brain into sort of functioning like you're two different people, or you've got two different brains, which is kind of wild. All right, so lateralization. So you can see down here at the bottom, also talking about debunking that idea of being left-brained or right-brained, but generally the left hemisphere is for things like language processing. We'll talk about the Broca's area and Wernicke's area in a second. And then visual and spatial tasks are on the right, generally, okay? So this is not a hard and fast thing because there is some crossover between those two areas. All right, so we talked about Brandon at the beginning of this chapter, a guy who got shot in the head while he was on active duty. I believe he was in Iraq, but he had a lot of issues doing things like reading after he had part of his brain removed. But through a lot of therapy, we'll talk about the point they were able to get him to later on. But we are now to the point where what I do for a living crosses over with what my wife does for a living. She is a speech therapist. She works with a lot of kids, specifically a lot of kids who have autism. So, people who have issues with speech pretty frequently have issues with one of these two areas. And so, you've got your Broca's area, which is right here-ish. So it is towards the front part of the brain on the left side. It's in the lobe called the temporal lobe. It's down here on the side. So Broca's area, what does it do? So it is critical for speech production. So probably a better way to say that is it is critical for language production, because there is a difference between language and speech. So even though even if I'm not capable of producing actual speech, which is a lot more to do with like the quality of my vocal folds and the muscles of my mouth and my sensory capabilities around my mouth. That's speech. Language, you don't even have to speak at all to be able to communicate through language. We have an entire sign language that doesn't involve speaking at all. But yeah, that's speech versus language. But either way, Broca's area, if there is some kind of damage to that, so if you have a traumatic brain injury, something like a stroke, which is where you're losing oxygen to a specific part of the brain, that can create something called Broca's aphasia, which is some kind of impairment on your language production. And sort of not the opposite of that, but going hand in hand with that is Wernicke's area. So that is a little bit further back in your temporal lobe. So it's a region of that cortex that plays a role in language comprehension. So that is the part going in. So Wernicke's area is comprehension, Broca's area is production. You will need to know the difference between those two things, what they do, etc. That's just important stuff. So my wife, before she started working with kids, she worked with a lot of old people. She worked at a skilled nursing facility. So right after people have gotten out of the hospital. So if they go to the hospital with a stroke, they get sent to this facility, and Tara would help them learn how to speak again, or just work through. She did a lot of swallowing studies with them as well. But one thing that she found with a lot of her stroke victims was impairments to these areas, and they have to sort of coach them through how to talk again. All right, so that's the left side of the brain, language production, language processing. So what happens on the right side? So this is a good example of how, yes, there is brain lateralization, but they're pretty much always working together. So think about this through the lens of language. So things like mental rotation of images, abstract and humorous use of language. So kids with autism, adults with autism too, language is not just your ability to take in the words themselves. So this is a good example of that. So the right side of my brain, the right side of my temporal lobe is going to take things in like facial recognition and detecting emotion, because there's a lot of nuances that come up in trying to figure out what someone is saying. So if you are hearing that's one of the reasons that autistic people have issues like picking up on like the finer points of like social cues, because a lot of that is communicated through very minute details that they may not pick up on. So things like facial recognition, detecting emotion, which is how we communicate a lot of things, whether we realize it or not. And one of the reasons we do that is because we have, through an idea called observational learning that we will talk about later on in the semester, we have picked up what these things mean through our interactions with other people. And if we have some kind of impairment on our developmental disorder and how we process that kind of stuff, that is obviously not going to work quite as well. Okay. All right. So I mentioned Tara's job, previous job, and she was working in her skilled nursing facility. So there's this idea of neuroplasticity. So if you have some kind of brain injury, a stroke, neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to sort of adapt to that. So if you have somebody who gets part of their brain removed, or even up to half of their brain removed, remember we talked about Phineas Gage a little bit. I don't know if we've actually talked about Phineas Gage, but he's a guy. We talk about Phineas later? Yeah, there he is. There's Phineas. Okay. So Phineas Gage gets an iron rod driven through his head. And his personality is very different from pre-accident to post-accident. What do you have to do to get yourself better? So part of this is therapy. Another part of it is neuroplasticity, which is your brain's ability to sort of use the neural connections it has to work around whatever impairment you have. So what can influence that? Why might somebody be able to recover from a brain injury better than somebody else? A big part of it is age. If you are young and you have a stroke, you have a much higher likelihood of being able to recover from that than if you are a little bit older. Things like diet and exercise are also factors. Substance abuse is a factor. So if you have done a lot of drugs, you're less likely to be able to recover from that. Let's see what else. Mental engagement, that's an important one. So if you are a person who reads a lot of books, gets up and does the Wordle every day, like you're more likely to be able to have good neuroplasticity. These are neurogenesis and like stem cell research are both things that are exploring the idea that we could either create new neurons, new nerve cells, or rehabilitate the old ones that have either been damaged or died. That is very much still developing. Your cerebral cortex. Okay, so you have a few cortices, which is the plural of cortex. So the biggest one is in the cerebrum. It's sort of see like the wrinkly bits. Those are all part of your cerebral cortex. Gray matter. So that is responsible for higher mental functions such as decision making, language, and processing visual information. So ours is a lot more developed than pretty much any other animal. Anytime you see like those wrinkles, those are a combination of something called gyri and sulci. So sulci is the sulcus is any sort of like dip, and then a gyri is sort of that wrinkly bit. So why does that happen? Well, it's because we have folded more brain into the same amount of space. So we're just creating more space for that brain to grow and develop. It is organized into 4 lobes. You got the frontal lobe, which is here at the front, as you might expect. Occipital lobe, way back here at the back. Occipital lobe is pretty much, anytime we see that, we're talking about visual information, so your ability to see and comprehend what you're seeing. Your parietal lobe, things that's going to be your sensory information, touch, temperature, sounds, things like that. Temporal lobe is going to deal with hearing and language comprehension. We talked about Broca's area, Wernicke's area. Those are both in your temporal lobe. Okay, so I don't know if there's a crash course video up on our course content where they talk about Phineas Gage a little bit more, but Phineas Gage was this guy. He was working on a construction site and a 3-foot iron rod because he was trying to tamp down gunpowder, and then gunpowder ignited and drove the rod that he was working with through his face. Before that, they said that he was well balanced, diligent, and then after the accident, he was unreliable, unpleasant, and vulgar. So why did that happen? Well, it's because, as you can see here on this little graphic, the iron rod went through the front part of his skull, which is your frontal lobe, which is where a lot of the things that govern your personality and your higher thought processes are. So if you have some kind of damage to that area, it will conceivably change your personality and your ability to think. So there is some evidence of neuroplasticity. So he obviously didn't die. So that's step one. But he was also able to sort of get back to a semi-normal life after this accident, which would suggest that his brain had learned to work around the impairment, which is pretty cool, but also don't recommend getting iron rods driven through your head. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of the major cortices in your brain. So you'll notice that in a lot of these cases, you have sort of information taking in and then information sending out part of the cortex. So in the motor cortex, this is towards the front part, the rear part of your frontal lobe, works with other regions to plan and execute voluntary movements. So it's in the middle, so it can kind of coordinate between your frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, all that stuff. So Penfield's map was sort of an early effort to figure out which part of the brain affected which activities. Also came up with this thing called a homunculus, which you can kind of see on the outside of this little map here. It's the guy with the face. So homunculus is this like graphic representation, not graphic, how would I say that? It almost looks like a little sculpture, but it's a representation of which parts of your body have the most neural cells, which are the most developed. So on a homunculus, specifically with the motor cortex, Your parts of your body that you need to be able to be the most intricate with, so like your hands, your mouth, things like that, are bigger. So this little guy, it just looks like a little human. He's got huge hands, a huge mouth, and smaller feet, because we don't do as much with our feet as we can with our hands. Like I can't write with my feet. I can't type on a computer with my feet. Your mouth also has a whole bunch of motor neurons, because speaking is a very intricate process. Being able to use your mouth to create words is an important part of that. So sort of the flip side of that is the somatosensory cortex, which pretty much does the same thing, just with receiving information. That's slightly different. So like, while the homunculus is of the motor cortex is showing you what you are able to do in terms of output, somatosensory homunculus is going to be a little bit different. So I have a lot more sensory neurons like on my tongue, so I can taste food. My ears are going to be pretty big because I have to be able to hear information. My eyes are going to be big because I have to be able to see things like that. So this is the part where you are taking in information. Okay, it's a little bit about Einstein and how he had a big brain. You already know that. Okay. Going through the lobes a little bit here. So the temporal lobes, things like the auditory cortex. This is the most, the thing we'll talk about the most, because it does other stuff, but we are mostly going to focus on auditory parts of it. So recognizing visual objects too. All this is part of language. Occipital lobe, we're pretty much only talking about visual information. It's all the way at the back of your head. Okay, this is a study that is examining sort of more development in different parts of the brain and how many Facebook friends a person might have. So what the examples they share are the superior temporal sulcus, which is in your temporal lobe, understanding and meaningful social movements, and then your entorhinal cortex, matching faces to names. So the question here is it the chicken or the egg? Are these people, did they already have more development in these areas, which made them better at Facebook, or did Facebook cause them to have more development in these areas? We don't know. It's a good question. It's a good psychological thing to study. Okay, we're on. Oh no, we still got some more. Okay, fly through this last part. All right, your limbic system. It regulates emotions and basic drives. So if your cerebral cortex is the higher developed one, as we get into the limbic system, it's what we call your old brain. This is one of the first things that develops. So this is going to be less intricate and involved processes. It's mostly going to be about surviving. So important structures here: the hippocampus, amygdala, thalamus, and hypothalamus. You do need to know what all of these things do, but we're going to go through them. It's going to be fine. Brainstem, I'm less worried about. So the brainstem involves things like your midbrain, reticular formation, pons, cerebellum, medulla, all that kind of stuff. But also involved with movement, generates arousal. Yeah, so you do need to know what the cerebellum does. Cerebellum is governing, like, well, the way I remember it is how to cerebalance with her cerebellum. So it governed things like fine motor and being able to adjust to external stimuli through movement. Okay, so structures of the brainstem. Do I have to go back? Yeah, okay, so I do need to go back. So hippocampus, we're talking about memory. Amygdala, we're talking about fear response. Thalamus and the hypothalamus, both of those are talking about regulating to homeostasis. So keeping your body in a state where you're not just freaking out all the time. Also, my dog is snoring. I don't know if you guys can hear. Okay, structures of the brainstem, you got your hindbrain, pons, medulla. I'm not really going to ask you about pretty much any of these, but if you want to, if you're foreseeing a future as like a PA or a doctor or something like that, you do need to know these. Neuroscientist, what have you. So your cerebellum, this is one I'll ask you about. So the little brain sits behind the brainstem, involved in muscle coordination and balance. So again, how to cerebalance with your cerebellum. So if you get pushed over, your ability to recover from that is governed by your cerebellum. Okay, we have made it all the way to the end. And these are our two case studies from the chapters. Our guy Brandon got shot in the head. Things are going well for him. After he recovered from that, could get back to doing things like reading and talking and all that kind of stuff. Got married, Mazel Tov. And then Christina, who's actually an SLP. Look at that. That's what my wife does. So she got half of her brain removed, and now she appears to be hashtag thriving. Okay. That is pretty much it on chapter 2. I know we kind of flew through that, but chapter 2 is a lot of vocabulary and figuring out which word goes with which function and things like that. So what we're going to do first should take questions for a second. Does anybody have any questions about any of that information? Because I know that was a lot of stuff. Okay, well, in that case, we are going to take a break. And we're going to come back at about, let's say 9:27-ish, and we will do our Kahoot. Okay, sounds good. Ready and break.